Hello and welcome to This Week in British History. My name is Philippa Lacey Brewell from British History Tours, and if you love British history then you are definitely in the right place. Each week I take you through events which happened in this week in British history. However, this week I have something a little bit special for you. It is in this week in British history, the 24th of March 1603, that Elizabeth I died. Now, Elizabeth I is the first historical figure that I was interested in. She is the whole reason why I got into history. She is the whole reason I got into travelling the UK's history and then becoming a tour guide and tour operator in order to do that for other people. So she is absolutely key in my story, and I am dedicating this episode to her and three particular elements of her story. Over the past few years, I have been around the country and I do a lot of filming, and these three locations that I'm going to take you to today are ones which cover three particular elements of her story. I'm going to take you to Hatfield House, where Elizabeth spent some of her childhood, where she was kept under house arrest, and Key, where she found out she was Queen of England on the death of her half-sister Mary I. I'm also going to take you to the Tower of London, where she spent time as prisoner also, and Kenilworth Castle, in my opinion, the bricks and mortar of the love story between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. So before we get started, please can I ask you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications so that you know when new videos are uploaded. Please give it a thumbs up if you like it, share it with your friends. If you comment below, I will certainly endeavour to comment, but I always do reply to my comments. I'm really appreciative of the time you take to watch these videos and to write comments. But I'm sure you want to now hear more about Elizabeth's story from the three locations that I've chosen for you today. So let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Tower of London, and I've come here today to talk to you about Elizabeth I as prisoner in the Tower of London. Now, the Tower really represents some of the darkest periods in Elizabeth's life. At the age of 2, her mother Anne Boleyn was brought here under trumped up charges of incest and adultery against the King Henry VIII. She was tried in the Great Hall here and executed within its walls on Tower Green. In 1554, Elizabeth found herself being brought here as prisoner under the orders of her half-sister Mary I. Now, Mary I had made a very unpopular marriage to the Catholic King of Spain, Philip II, and this had set off the Wyatt Rebellion. And Elizabeth found herself implicated in the Wyatt Rebellion. As a Protestant and as of royal blood, she could be seen as a figurehead for any Protestant rebellion against the Catholic Mary I. And so Mary I saw her as a threat, and she had her arrested, had her brought to the Tower, and she was kept in the Bell Tower for 8 weeks. And she was interrogated to try and find some kind of incrimination of her in the Wyatt Rebellion. Now, either she was very savvy or she just didn't have anything to do with that rebellion, but they found no incriminating evidence at all. But she did spend 8 weeks, that's such a long time, 8 weeks, not knowing if she was about to be called for execution. And that memory, those feelings stuck with her for the rest of her life. And even as Queen, she would refer to her time at the Tower of London as a prisoner. She was brought to the Tower by boat, so that there could be no rescue attempts. They feared rescue attempts if they brought her by road. So that meant she came in through Traitor's Gate on the river. And she made one of her famous sort of short speeches when as she came up those slippery steps from her barge. So here Elizabeth would have come at high tide through the gate on her barge, up those steps, proclaiming, "Here landeth as true a subject, being prisoner as ever landed at these stairs. I come in as no traitor, but as a true woman to the Queen's Majesty, as any now living, and thereon I will take my death." The wardens apparently dropped to their knees, shouting, "God preserve your grace," whether that's true or a romantic sort of story made up after the event, we don't know, but I think the respect for Elizabeth, certainly afterwards, was great. And death was a real possibility for Elizabeth here. If she had been found to be implicated in the Wyatt Rebellion or have had any knowledge of it, she could have found herself under the same fate as Lady Jane Grey and executed within the Tower of London. Good morning everybody, it's Philippa from British History Tours. Today I'm at Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire. And Kenilworth Castle for me is the bricks and mortar behind the greatest love story of Elizabeth I. Now, we think of Elizabeth I by her titles, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, but these titles were given to her sort of after. There was a bit of a summary really of her reign. There was no inevitability about her not marrying. And like I say, for me, Kenilworth is the bricks and mortar behind the greatest of her love stories. As Queen, she couldn't just marry anybody she liked. England was still in a very precarious situation. It hadn't been long since the break with Rome. You had Mary I, who preceded Elizabeth, who was Catholic, who wanted to return the country to Catholicism, and then you had Elizabeth, who took over from her, who was Protestant. And every Catholic European country could be a threat to England because they would want to bring England back under the Catholic umbrella and under the Pope. So Elizabeth was in a fairly precarious position, and her marriage, any suitors, really needed to be foreign princes, somebody who an alliance could be formed with for the defence of England and the future of the kingdom as an independent country. But in my mind, through all the research I've done about Elizabeth, her actual true love was a man called Robert Dudley. Kenilworth Castle was owned by Robert Dudley. And the apartments behind me, they're now called the Leicester Buildings, but these apartments were built especially for Elizabeth for her visits here to Kenilworth, which is why I say that Kenilworth for me is the bricks and mortar behind Elizabeth's greatest love story. Elizabeth visited Kenilworth on 4 occasions, 2 times in the 1560s, and then she came back in 1572 and 1575. In between the first 2 and the second 2 visits, Robert Dudley had built her these apartments behind her, these state apartments purely for her use. He'd also, I don't know if it's by 1572, but certainly by 1575, created the Elizabethan Gardens, which are here, which are absolutely stunning. And if you do get to come to Kenilworth, make sure you make time to go around the gardens. So yeah, Elizabeth and Robert had known each other since childhood, and they were at least best friends, but in my mind, probably childhood sweethearts. And the clincher for me was the evidence behind, or the evidence I think for behind her true feelings for him, is his last letter. Robert Dudley died, I think it was in the 1580s. Elizabeth didn't die till 1603, so he died quite a few years before her. And he'd written to her a week before he died. And despite him being one of many suitors for Elizabeth, he held a special place in her heart, and that last letter that he wrote, she kept. Not only did she keep it, but she labelled it just his last letter. Not Robert's last letter, not Leicester's last letter, just his last letter, which I think speaks volumes about her feelings for the man. Not only did she keep the letter, not only did she just title it his last letter, but she kept it by his bed for the rest of her life. So for me, Kenilworth represents that bond that those two had in bricks and mortar, because these were the apartments that Robert Dudley built for her, especially for when she visited. So like I say, she visited after these had been built. She visited again twice, 1572 and 1575. The fact that she'd visited here on 4 occasions is pretty significant. I'm not sure if there are other places around the country quite so far away from London which she would have visited on quite as many occasions. But it was definitely the site of her longest ever visit. In 1575, she spent 19 days here. That's the longest she ever spent at any courtier's house at all. And it was Robert's last-ditch attempt to persuade Elizabeth to marry him. There were many reasons why she couldn't
or wouldn't marry Robert. As I've already said, he wasn't a foreign prince, and we needed Elizabeth Council wanted her to marry a foreign prince for an alliance. He wasn't really of great enough stature. He was the second son of the Earl of Warwick. His father had been executed. His elder brother was the Earl of Warwick. Although Robert became the Earl of Leicester under Elizabeth, that wasn't a title he was born to. And the third reason is that he had been implicated in the strange death of his second wife, Amy, who had been ill. She had been quite ill, but the story goes that she had sent her entire household out to a country fair, and when they returned, she was found at the bottom of the stairs and her neck was broken. So whether that was from a fall, whether she committed suicide, or whether it had been murder, it had left Robert free to marry, but obviously in very dark circumstances, and the rumours spread and the Queen couldn't be implicated in that. And for me, that was the nail in the coffin. Although it was fairly unlikely she was ever going to be able to marry him, that was the nail in that deal. It wasn't going to happen after that point. So I hope you've enjoyed that little snippet of Kenilworth Castle and Elizabeth's love story with Robert Dudley.
Hello everybody, so I've come to Hatfield House to talk to you about Elizabeth becoming Queen, because it was in the grounds of Hatfield House that she discovered that she was Queen on the 17th of November 1558. Now, Elizabeth was an unlikely Queen, really, in that if you think about her childhood, so she was born with, big pomp and circumstance, but there was no hiding the fact that it was a massive disappointment that her father, Henry VIII, had broken with Rome. He'd gone through 6 years of real disruption for the country, but he saw it as for himself, in order to marry Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. And then Elizabeth was born a girl instead of, what surely should have been a boy. She was christened Princess, which means heir to her father's throne, but at the age of 2, with the downfall of her mother Anne Boleyn and Anne Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth's status was reduced to merely the Lady Elizabeth. She was stripped of her household, and she began living in the household of either her sister or here with her brother Edward VI. She did actually share some of his education and some of their childhood together. Obviously that was a bit later on, after Edward had been born via Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. During the reigns of her half-siblings, Edward VI and Mary I, Elizabeth had been implicated in various rebellions or scandals of the time. So under Edward VI, Elizabeth found herself prisoner, kept under house arrest at Hatfield for what was she not involved in the Thomas Seymour scandal? Now, Thomas Seymour was Edward VI's uncle. He was the younger brother of Edward Seymour, who had become Lord Protector, so he was ruling a council in place of Edward while Edward was a minor. And obviously they were both brothers of Edward's mother, Jane Seymour. Now, Thomas Seymour was just as ambitious as his brother Edward was, but didn't have the position, and he looked for other ways to get that. And he had thought about marrying Elizabeth, but that was vetoed. He in fact married Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, so his widow effectively, and they had been married, and Elizabeth had lived with them for a time. Now, Thomas seemed to not have given up on his ideas of seducing Elizabeth, and there are many accounts of him doing things that we would find now to be they were obviously disturbing to her at the time. We would probably class them as some sort of sexual abuse now. He would go into her room before she was awake. He would smack her on the bottom. There was a very strange incident that happened with Catherine Parr. Catherine was obviously really taken with Thomas Seymour in a kind of obsessive way that she saw no wrong in him, because this incident is one that demonstrates it. She held Elizabeth while Thomas ripped her skirts or slashed her skirts. which is just bizarre. So, but because of these incidents, because of this interaction with Thomas Seymour, when Thomas was basically getting too big for his boots in the court of Edward VI, Elizabeth was implicated. People spread rumours they were secretly married or she was pregnant by him. And at Hatfield House there is a letter in Elizabeth's own hand to the court, to her brother, saying basically, let me come to court, let me show you I'm not pregnant by him, I have nothing to do with him. And that's inside at Hatfield House. So that was under Edward VI. Then you have under Mary I, she was allowed to come to Hatfield House in 1558 when, earlier than 1558, but when Mary I believed she was pregnant. Mary I believed she was pregnant. She believed she was securing her line. She believed she was going to keep the Catholic faith in England. So everything was fine, and Elizabeth was allowed to come to Hatfield House, where she'd spent a lot of her childhood. So she was very familiar with this area, and she did enjoy being here. She was in the grounds of Hatfield House when she found out she was queen. Mary I had died in the early hours of the 17th of November 1558, probably of a tumour which had started with her believing she was pregnant, but actually her pregnancy turned out to be a false pregnancy and was likely the tumour that eventually did kill her. So behind me you can see what Elizabeth would have recognised the building that's behind me. This is the Great Hall of Hatfield House. Most of the house was destroyed in the reign of James I and rebuilt. And the Great Hall behind me remained as stables for the new house, and remained so until in the sort of state of a stables until 1915, when it was renovated and brought back to its original state. Let's talk about Elizabeth's heritage. Her parents' marriage, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's marriage, had been annulled. Her mother had been found to be, supposedly adulterous, incestuous, and so Elizabeth was disgraced from that side. However, her father was still Henry VIII. But when she became queen, there were many who believed she shouldn't have been queen, and so, as with all the Tudors, their lineage became top importance, proving that the Tudors were the rightful heirs, that each one of them in turn was the right one to be taking over the throne, and Elizabeth was no different. Elizabeth had this uphill battle to climb more than any of them, maybe since her granddad, Henry VII. And inside Hatfield there is I suppose like a family tree, but it links her back supposedly to a huge, just an amazing collection of people, either real or now we know to be not real. So she is supposedly linked to King Arthur, some of the Roman emperors, Noah, so you get biblical characters in there, and right back to Adam and Eve. So this lineage is it's a fascinating piece of parchment to look at. It's really interesting, so if you come here again, that's something you must see. Hi everyone, so let's talk about the oak that Elizabeth I was supposed to have been sat underneath. Now I would love to be able to tell you that it's one of these big gnarly oaks that are here in the grounds of Hatfield House, but I'm afraid the original oak died, and so we don't have that anymore. But there is an oak in its place. Rather nicely, I think. It was planted by our current queen, so Queen Elizabeth II, in the same site as the original oak. Thank you so much for watching this episode of This Week in British History, the Elizabeth I special. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up, comment, do all that. I would really appreciate it. Please do share it with your friends if you think they would enjoy it too. But for now, keep well, keep safe, and I will see you all next time. Lots of love. Bye.